But my mom, when she took me back to my grandparents after she OD'd, what we found out is that she was running because she had committed murder. She killed a man.
Wow. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Fierce Fridays. My name is Elise, and today I am joined by Miss Yvonne Brooks, licensed clinical social worker and owner of Repair of the Breach Counseling and Consultation Services. Yvonne, thank you so much for joining me today.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me, Elise.
I'm so excited to get into your story because I really consider it to be one of challenges to triumph. You have experienced a lot, and it started from a very early age. Please tell us a little bit about your childhood.
Okay. My mother had me when she was 16. She got involved in recreational drugs at a pretty young age, before the age of 16. So while having me, she stopped using for the sake of it not harming me. After I was born, my mother resumed her life, which was basically in the streets. Um, she used drugs, she sold drugs, and my mother did not. I can't recall my mom having a lot of time with me. I was practically raised up in my grandparents' house. My grandparents had already had 6 kids of their own, and their kids were teenagers and basically grown by the time I was born. So they raising 6 kids of their own. Who wants to raise a seventh? My grandmother was working full time. So that it was a house where I didn't have a lot of supervision, meaning I can recall the age of 7 or 8 being able to leave the house while my grandparents would have parties on the weekend and stay at a friend's house and nobody would notice I was missing. Or come
Wow.
in 2 in the morning because my girlfriend's mom was an alcoholic, so she didn't really pay attention to what we were doing. I recall feeling almost invisible as a kid. There was a lot of chaos that took place in our home. I had uncles in the house, so they were always fighting each other. And it was physical fights, which would often lead me to having a lot of stomach issues. At the time, I didn't realize it was anxiety and nervousness. My grandmother would often have to take me to the hospital. They didn't know what was wrong. But a lot of it was due to the turmoil in my home. And with my mom, I never knew when I was going to see her, and I never knew when I wasn't going to see her. So she was in and out the picture very often. I didn't know my dad. But my mother was my world. I lived in this fantasy world as a child that one day I would have this normal life of just me and my mom as a family. Unfortunately, in my childhood, that didn't take place. My mom had times where she tried, but I would always end up right back with my grandparents. I recall sleeping next to the door, waiting on my mom, like a little puppy waiting on my mother to come home, not knowing when she was going to come home. So because of that, I wasn't in school. My attendance in school was sporadic. When she did take me back to my grandparents' house, and then she went to I don't know where. My mother was also in and out of prison. Um, when that took place, I ended up getting put back a grade in school. I already had personal challenges. For one, um, I was cross-eyed. When your eyes be like this, and the kids,
Yes.
like, how many fingers I got up? You say two, they be like, and they start laughing and say four. Even though you're looking at 2 fingers, right? So that was difficult for me. And being my mom's only child, when she was around, she would make me fight. And she would make me fight because kids would often pick on me because of how I looked at the time. So in my mind, I'm this little ugly duckling, right? And that was my favorite show too. Uh, by the way, I would watch it during Christmas time and just cry like this, you know, asking God to one day help me be a beautiful swan. Mind you, I didn't know who God was at the time, but I was just hoping that one day that would change. So again, not having her around, my grandparents did the best that they could. You know, my grandfather was a truck driver, so he was gone most of the time, and it was my grandmother working full time, and having my 3 uncles in the house. They were young adults, and didn't know what to do with a kid. It was a whipping and a beating for everything. The discipline from my grandmother. It seemed like I was always getting disciplined, but had no real structure. So in my mind as a child, I felt like I was being spanked and hit and whipped because people liked it. So that led to me becoming very angry and having a lot of hurt and anger on the inside that as a child I couldn't describe. So the way that I would handle it when I would get these overwhelming feelings of energy, sadness and frustration is I would beat like my cat. And I mean literally beat it till it pooped on itself to the point where I would start to cry. I would feel so bad afterwards. But that's just as a child how much pent up anger and frustration and sadness I had that I was unable to explain. Not to mention when my grandmother would go to work, she would take me over to a neighbor's house who would leave me with her brother, which my grandmother wasn't aware of, who molested me from the ages of 4 to 6. And I would cry every time my grandmother took me over there. But still, as a child, I didn't have the words to tell her what was going on. I didn't have the words to say that, he was touching me in such a way that it hurt me or making me do things to him that I couldn't even explain or didn't even understand myself, only knew that it was wrong, you know. So um, I would say it was pretty tumultuous, as a child. But in my mind, my light was always my mom coming back, anticipating her coming back. And so she finally came back when I was about 7 years old. Of course, like I said, in and out. And this time she took me away with her. Um, we went to a shelter, and I could recall my mom had always taught me how to call 911. It was Christmas Eve. My mother was in the bathroom. She'd been in there too long. I kept knocking on the door. She didn't answer. And when I opened the door, I found her on the floor. She had OD'd off of heroin.
Mm.
And so the cops came. They took her, and I was put with some people there. Don't know who they were, and her and their children. And that's how I spent my Christmas that year. Again, constantly teased by kids, picked on by kids. I was a real mild mannered child, which you will later hear that, that kind of stuff rose a little storm in me. I became something else in my teenage years, right? So my mom ended up taking me back to my grandparents. And mind you, like I told you before, when it came to the spankings and the whoopings in the house, my grandfather, when he would get drunk, Lord have mercy, some of the things that he would do as far as beatings was just unheard of. Um, which I later ended up in foster care because of how he would discipline. But my mom, when she took me back to my grandparents after she OD'd, what we found out is that she was running because she had committed murder. She killed a man.
Wow.
And so she was placed in prison. I remember sitting in the court crying. And I remember her telling the judge that she had a daughter to raise and things of that nature. And as young as I was, I can recall feeling like, but mom, you weren't there. It's like I'm used as your excuse, but you weren't there. And when I saw her before we left the courthouse for the last time, she cried and cried and cried. Mind you, my mother was about 23 years old when this happened. And it's interesting because as an adult, it helps me to put it in a different light than I
Right.
did seeing it as a child. So she gone to prison, and they told her that she was going to have anywhere from 7 to 15 years in prison. So at that time, of course, I'm still living with my grandparents, kids in the neighborhood teasing me because my mom is now in prison. My aunt and uncle stopped by one day and he saw that I was there alone. I was like 8 years old. And little did I know, he went back to my aunt and was like, we need to take custody of her because he didn't want me to end up the way that my mom had ended up. And I didn't learn that till later. Um,
All right.
I was 8, girl. I was in there stealing out of grocery store. My grandparents wasn't around. If I needed something to eat, I went and I stole it, which was something that
Wow. It's survival,
it
right?
was, which was something that my
Survival.
mother taught me. I remember my mother used to take me in the stores. We would walk in and I walk out with shoes that wasn't mine that I walked in with. I would see her put steaks in her purse. So I learned how to shop.
Mercy.
Um, I would go and steal flea and tick spray for my dog because my grandmother wouldn't go and buy it for the dog. So this one time I got caught in the store, and that's when my uncle was like, "Oh yeah, we really need to take her."
Wow.
So
Because you were like 8, right? You said you were
I
8?
was. So at the age of
Wow.
8, I moved with my aunt and my uncle, um, which I am going to say was probably it had its trials, but it was probably where I was molded the most. And it had the greatest impact on me because my aunt was a Christian. And she was the only person, even though we didn't really practice Christianity that much, but she was the only person that you could truly see Christ in. She had this like really loving demeanor about her. My aunt barely spanked me. She would talk to me. My aunt was the type of person, because I loved her so much, she could talk to me and it would make me cry. You know,
Hmm.
just to disappoint her would be a disappointment to me. Now, my uncle, on the other hand, they didn't know when they took this 8-year-old in that this 8-year-old had been molested. They didn't know the physical abuse I had endured. They didn't know the chaos that was in the house. And so my uncle, was, in my mind, spank me for the smallest of things. If he walked in and said hello and I didn't say hello back because my mind is preoccupied or I'm somewhere else, I would be disciplined for that. I would get in trouble if I didn't wash the dishes right. And so, in my mind as a child, nobody's going to hit me again. I'm screaming on the inside. So, when my uncle would go to discipline me, I would hit him back.
I'm guessing he didn't like that.
He's in his 20s, all male macho. I'm not gonna have this kid hitting on me that I can't, and feeling like I can't discipline him. So I would get it even worse. And then I got to a point where I was very stubborn, where he would spank me, and I didn't care how hard you hit me. I wasn't gonna cry. I just was not gonna give you that satisfaction. And so I developed a hatred for my uncle. Because I didn't fully understand him, and neither did he fully understand me. But it wasn't until my adult years that we were able to have a conversation, and for me to help him to recognize who I was as a child. And he said, had I known that, I would not have handled you like that. But when I thought about who he was at the time, he was 20 some years old, you know,
Wow.
with 2 kids and took in a third.
Right.
Him and my aunt, they were young. They didn't know themselves. Most of us raised kids the way that we were raised. Back then, that was the majority of of what was used. And sometimes it was overboard, and oftentimes people didn't recognize that. So, because they didn't always just feel like whippings, you know. You dodge the belt, you get a black eye, because buckle them hits you in the eye.
Wow.
But but my aunt, and I remember as a kid, I would say, "You don't have to hit me, just talk to me. Just talk to me." You know. But needless to say, by the age of 8, I was a headstrong child. I had basically been doing my own thing, coming in when I felt like it, kind of thing. I wasn't used to rules and structure, but going into their home, I began to thrive because they had rules, because they had structure. I recall the teacher that she had me under that first year. I cried like a baby. That teacher could not get me away from her. But all of those things came from not having my mom. All of those feelings of needing that nurturing, needing that attachment, attaching myself to whoever showed me love, whoever showed me that they were there and that they cared. So, I stayed with my aunt and my uncle till I was about 13. When I was 13, my uncle came in one day and he was pretty stressed out from work. He was working 2 jobs, and he got on me. I was doing chores, and he felt like I didn't do something right, and he hit me, and that was it for me. I totally lost it on my uncle. I was hitting him with the broom. He threw me up against the wall, holding the wall with my head. It was, when I say it was an all out raw fight. My uncle had scratches all over his face, and at that point he was like, "She gotta go." So he sent me back, to my grandparents. At my grandparents' home, at the age of 13, that wasn't a place to be. Given you can do whatever you want, however you want, whenever you want. There was no real structure. Through it was you're nothing, you're nobody, you'll never amount to anything in life. Um, Unfortunately, my grandmother didn't have the words to say, "Hey, you have a character that's similar to your mom, and I'm so afraid for you."
Mm.
I'm afraid that if you continue this route, this is where you're going to go. She was so afraid that it was just put down after put down after put down. And it had been like that since I was a child. So, I didn't have much of a self-esteem. I probably looked like I was confident, but I wasn't. Um, Going back to my grandparents, I was in the seventh grade, and I recall going to my school principal and saying, "Hey, if I get all A's and B's this semester, will you put me back in my right grade?" Because mind you, I had been put back a grade due to my mom. But when I moved with my aunt, I excelled, and so I did. I got put in my right grade. I graduated in the eighth grade. And it's funny because when I think back to those kind of things, it's like, wow, you did that as a kid.
Yeah, that
And
takes a
mind
lot.
you, I had an education. But everything I did after leaving my aunts was always to make her happy. I still hadn't learned how to love myself enough to make me happy, um, or to value myself. I had to do it for somebody else. And so at that point in time in my life, it was for my aunt, you know. So by the time I turned 14, yeah, I was boy crazy. That's a given, right?
No, not at all. Mm-mm.
So I wasn't that fortunate young 14-year-old that was like, boys, it's like, hey, bring it. So this girl need a whole lot of love. So my grandmother was not happy with that. And one day my granddad came home. He had been drunk. And I was outside. Mind you, I was outside looking for my cat. And I wasn't doing anything I didn't have any business doing. But my grandfather came home. He assumed that because some guys were across the street outside, that I was out there trying to be fast. Well, I wasn't. So he comes in the house, he's yelling and screaming at me. I'm telling him I wasn't doing anything. And so my grandfather beats me with a shovel.
A
And I
shovel.
mean, yes, a shovel. It was what they would call a hoe back in the day, where you just actually literally stick your foot on it because it was
Hmm.
steel, to go under the ground. And he beat me, and he beat me pretty bad. And I recall fighting him back and taking a hair dryer that you would sit under,
Hmm.
and I took it and I hit my grandfather upside the head with it, but he was so drunk he didn't even feel it, right? But when he was done with me, I could barely walk down a flight of steps. My aunt found out what happened. There was a lot of abuse when they were coming up too, so she called protective services. They came out, and at that point, I was put in foster care. Now, I was blessed. My first foster mom, um, I was blessed with her. Her name was Lorraine Taylor. She is gone now, and she always called me her miracle baby. But she was an educator, and she took four of us teenagers in. And I'm telling you, it's hard for people to take in teenagers in foster care. So it was me and my four sisters. Today, they're still my sisters. But anyhow, she took us in. She was a beautician, and she was the first person I ever traveled with. She took me to North Carolina. She was the first person who took me to um, music concerts. And I still gave mom a run for her money, but she never had to lay a hand on me. But she had a way of disciplining us where her word was her word. And she did not compromise with you.
Consistency. You got
Yes,
consistent.
she was extremely consistent. And I used to try to manipulate, and she would tell me, good try. But that woman loved her some me, and I was definitely loved her. And so my mom came home when I was 15, and it's just like that kid who could be abused by a parent. That parent is still their world. So um, by then, I did have some really bad anger issues. As much as Lorraine loved me, she prevented me from being expelled from school. I had beat a boy with a lock, uh, and beat him pretty bad in high school. So coming up in Detroit, it was a different place and space. And although I looked one way, I was something else on the other end, on the inside. I told you, being a kid, that I became what we would consider to be a quiet storm, and
Hmm.
would mess with the quietness, and they would get the storm. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, she crazy, right? it was a boy who had a crush on me in school, and I did not like him like that. And I was still always, sweet and nice. And I told him, I was like, today is not a good day. And I knew he would be so immature because he liked me. And I told him, I said, today isn't a good day. My foster mom had taken me to therapy. And when she took me, the therapist didn't close up some stuff before we left.
Oh boy.
So I
You
walked
were
into the
just
school
emotions
wide
wide
open.
open.
And she told the therapist, she said, I will never bring her to you again. And that's how I learned some things you don't open up in therapy if you don't have time to close it. Because you don't know what you're going to leave people walking out the door like. And so when she
Exactly.
took me to school that day, she said, are you sure you want to go? And I said, yeah. And I went and walked in, and here comes this young man. He's doing all his theatrics, bothering me. I said, today is not a good day. And he said, and I just didn't like him like that, but I wasn't rude to him, you know. So he goes over to this girl at a locker, and he goes, I want you to go over there and beat that bitch's ass for me.
No.
Yeah, and I always went to school with a mini skirt on and some pair of shorts underneath. So, girl, my
Just
thing
and
was,
you were ready. You were
yep, it
ready.
was always in Detroit. You had to be. And so when I heard that, I took that lock off, wrapped it around my finger, said to the girl, "Excuse me," and I went to beating everything in his skull that I could.
Oh goodness.
Blood was all over that hallway, and it was his. So, with my foster mom working in the schools, she prevented me from being expelled because she knew the superintendent. But I was out for 10 days, and she made sure I did chores and everything else. But within that time, my mom came home, and I had all kinds of mixed emotions. My my home worker who would come out once every 2 weeks or so, she'd already told me if I got into another fight, because there were times I would fight, in the home, and she told me if I got into another fight, then I would be put out. So, and my foster mom didn't really want that. But this one day, one of my foster sisters, who's mouthy, but I love her to death. One day she was being mouthy, and I knew I would get in trouble. So me and her got into a scuffle. I would never truly hurt my sisters. We would push each other around sometimes, but with me and her, let me put it that way. Um, but anyhow, because her mouth was annoying to me. But this day, we pushed each other around, and I did get put out, and I did get sent to what was called Vista Maria, which was a lockup basically facility for girls. And while I was there, I could see I was going to be fighting all the time, so I went AWOL. And that's when I went to go and be with my mom. And I recall not wanting my mother to come back to the neighborhood that she left out of fear that she'd become who she was before she left. And I recall my greatest disappointment was my mom was standing out on the porch and she was smoking marijuana. And I had been sitting out on the porch. I had come out on the porch. And so I said to her, I said, Mom, I was out here first. And she said, well, it's nothing but a plant. So I got up and I went to the door and I said, okay. So when you see me smoking it, I'm going to tell you it's nothing but a plant, right? So it was because of watching her and my uncles, be alcoholics and get into drugs, that I was very anal about things like that as a child. Even in my teen years, I didn't want to smoke. I didn't want to drink. I didn't want to do anything that would cause me to be different than who I really was. And I didn't want to make choices under the influence. My mother wasn't just doing marijuana. She'd started back doing heroin. And growing up, throwing away her needles, trying to protect her as a child, I was tired as a teenager. I was so tired. I didn't want to go through that anymore. As a little kid, I could recall running up the alley, throwing her drugs away, doing everything I could to stop her from becoming the person that I would see her be once she was under the influence. I didn't want to see the needles and put, her with her friends and them shooting up, and, I'm taking care of her when she got cold sweats. That's why I didn't go to school. That's why my school attendance was sporadic. I would be home taking care of my mom, putting towels on her forehead, making cereal for her and me in the morning,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. And so that just came back to me at 15. And I was like, I don't want to do this anymore. So I called my worker and I got put back into foster care. I asked them to put me back in. That hurt my mom. But
Wow.
she called me one day and she'd asked me a favor. She wanted to know if I would pee in a cup for her because she knew she wasn't going to pass the drug test when she went to go see her parole officer. And I said no. And she said, well, you must want me to go to prison then, back to prison. And I said, no, you want to go back to prison.
Right. She's
Uh,
making choices. Yeah.
I told her, I said, no, I'm not the one that makes that choice. You do. You want to go back to prison. And then I let my mother have it. I had never, ever talked back to my mom or disrespect my mom. For one, you just didn't do that. She would beat the living crap out of you, and you knew it. In my mother never really had to whip on me, but in the neighborhood, she was known for for laying hands. Now, I guess that's where I ended up getting it from.
Yeah. Yeah.
She didn't look like it, but she was known for it, right? So because my mother was known for that, I didn't play with my mom. But this particular day, and in a very respectful way, I let my mother have it. I told my mother all the things I'd gone through with the hopes of being able to have her. You know, I told her all the abuse, all the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, even taking care of her as a
Mm-hmm.
child. By then you're 15, are able to look back and recognize
Yeah.
some of the dysfunctions in what that you've gone through that was not normal, you know. And I'm crying and I'm yelling and I'm screaming at her and I'm telling her all these things. And I made my mother cry. And she told me when she saw me, she called me a bitch. She told me when she saw me, she was gonna beat my ass.
Oh my goodness.
And so we didn't talk for a month. And she called me the day before Thanksgiving. It was in the 80s. She called me the day before Thanksgiving. And she said, I'm not going to do anything. I'm sorry. I want to see you. I want you to come for the holidays. She picked me up that night. We spent time together that night. We spent Thanksgiving together and we had an awesome time. She had a beautiful voice. And I recall her singing the song Precious Lord by Al Green.
Mm.
And there was a point in the song where it said, Lord, I'm tired, I'm weary, and I'm weak.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so my mom stopped in the middle of that song and she said, the Lord was talking to me the other day and he said, Divine, you got to stop what you're doing. And she said, I would, but I don't know how. And so my mom had asked me to come home with her that night. And I was like, nah, because her phone wasn't working. Right? She didn't have a phone and I wanted to be
Mm-hmm.
on my friends that night. So I told her I'd see her in the morning. Um, and her boyfriend came over while I was getting ready to go get myself together to go see her and told me my mom had died
Oh
and
my
she died
goodness.
of a drug overdose. So that I would say, out of everything I gone through with by that time, was the most traumatic um, event for me. I became extremely quiet. Um, I didn't even want to go to the funeral, let alone cry at the funeral. Um, because she was my world. And so my world came to an end because that's how I defined her. Everything I did was for her. And it was always for the hope of having this family. Now, mind you, I didn't know God or understand who God was. I was, we went to church, holidays, and things like that, but that still wasn't a part of my who I was. So, um, I acted out in various different ways. Um, After the death of my mother, I didn't want to go to school, and so I basically dropped out my 10th grade year. My attendance was extremely sporadic. I was 15. Um, my mother had befriended a childhood friend who was a dope dealer that lived up the street, and he would always call me his daughter. Mind you, I wanted to be loved as if somebody was my parent. And
Right.
so, of course, after my mother died, um, he would tell me, I'm going to be there for you. When me and my grandmother would have our huge fights, he would come pick me up, and take me somewhere where I could stay and get myself a little peace of mind. And so one day he picked me up and he took me, normally he would take me to a hotel and leave me with money and he would leave. This day he didn't. Um, he came in, he stayed. He brought alcohol with him, which I didn't drink alcohol. Um, Needless to say, that was the night that I learned he really didn't want to be a father to me. He wanted to be something else. And so I was 15 and he was in his 30s. And at that point in time in my life, and I didn't want it, I didn't want it, but I just got used to it, you know? And so that stayed with me until he was in my life until I was about 17. I knew that if I didn't break away from him, I would end up like the women that he dealt with. He beat them and he had total control over their lives. And I didn't want that for my life. Um, at the time, I depended on him financially. Um, and I left my grandparents' house because when I did, as far as foster care was concerned, I stayed out once my mom died. I gone back briefly to Miss Taylor's house after my mother died, but I ended up beating one of the girls that came there. He was a bully, and like I said, now I was never the type of person who would pick on people. But if you bothered me or you picked on me, you got it and you got it back. And so she was that type of person. And I used to try and talk to her and say, hey, you don't have to be like that here. You don't have to try and bully people. Well, because I look so innocent and sweet and calm, like somebody could beat me, she tried me and ended up in the hospital. So I went AWOL again.
Gosh, the
You
quiet
know,
storm.
yeah, right. Came in like a tornado. Like unfortunately, I had the type of anger and rage in me that probably could have took someone's life. Because when I would lose it so bad that I wouldn't realize the damage I did to people until it was over. It would be a true blind rage where I would not really be cognizant of what I was doing and had strength like out of this world. But anyway, and nothing but 119 pounds. But um, so anyhow, I just went AWOL from foster care altogether after that. And I ended up going to stay with a great aunt whose mouth was no better than my grandmother's because they had been raised by the same person, which is put downs and all those kind of things. But I always had my aunt, the first one that I stayed with, who always believed in me. So no matter where I was, she would build me. And so because of her, I went back to high school. My 12th grade year, because I was tired of hearing my great aunt, consistently put me down, I went back into the system and I went into semi-independent living. And my aunt was so scared, my first aunt. She was so scared that with me doing that, I wasn't going to graduate from high school. But by then, my mind was made up. I was going to graduate. And I graduated with a 1.72. And my thing was, at least I made it,
Yeah, you graduated. That's an accomplishment. People in your family.
And I did it for my aunt.
Yeah.
I did it for my love for her, which taught me in life once I did start working with at-risk kids is that sometimes they'll do it for you before they do it for themselves. And that's too, So I did it for her. And so once I graduated, life was just, to me, it just wasn't worth living. I recall around the holidays, I tried to commit suicide. And my aunt came to me while I was in the hospital because I had taken some of everybody's pills. Didn't know foods or what I had taken, but I really wanted to die because in my mind I had nothing to live for. I didn't have my mother, I didn't have a father, I didn't have brothers, I didn't have sisters, and I just wanted to die. I felt like life was just too hard, and I remember saying I didn't ask to be here. Um, and so when I tried, you know, of course it didn't. It ended up, not following through because I'm still here today.
Mhm. Sure are talking to us right now.
When I was taken to the hospital, my aunt came in and I saw how much I hurt her.
Mm.
I said to myself, I'd never do it again because of the pain that it caused her. And when she was in the hospital, she looked at me and she said, Yvonne, God has a purpose for your life. He has a calling on your life. And she said, and she was so soft spoken. She said, if you ever try this again, I'll kill you myself. But I just recall the pain that I caused her. And out of everybody in my life, I never wanted to ever hurt her again. So I never tried it again. My aunt would call me after that, always around the holidays, to make sure
Mm.
I was okay. Right. So after graduating from high school, um, like I said, life felt empty. And I met my children's dad when I was 18, going on 19. Hung out with him for a while and decided that I wanted to be a mom because I didn't have a family of my own. I thought if I had a child, it would come into this world, it would love me. Nobody told me it was going to come in and be like, feed me, clothe me, take care of me, right?
That's right. Gimme, gimme, gimme. That's how children come into the
Yeah.
world. Yep.
So while living out on my own and being impulsive and immature, thinking that I was in love, um, because he told me all these good things about myself. And I thought he was a sweet guy. He was just immature. We were both young, dumb, and I don't want to say it on here, but yeah. Um,
I got you. I understand.
hormones.
Full of hormones. Yes, that is the YouTube friendly way to say it.
Right. So he agreed with me with having a kid. Uh, so I got pregnant with my son fairly quick. Needless to say, while I was pregnant, he was off doing his own thing with other girls, and that totally broke me because he was my world, right? He was my world because I didn't know how to be my own world. I didn't know how to value myself, so I depended on everybody else to define me, So he was able to make my day or break my day. And while pregnant with my son and being alone again, uh, my aunt, who, like I told you before, has been very pivotal in my life, she had joined a Christian faith and a different church than what we grew up. We grew up Baptist. She joined the Seventh day Adventist. And I started studying with her. And I started studying with the church. So I became a Christian while I was 6 months pregnant with my son. And when the Lord says, therefore, if any man be in Christ, he becomes a new creature, right?
Mm-hmm.
My life, after giving my life over to the Lord, totally changed. But it was with a process of time. I given birth to my son, got back with his dad long enough to get pregnant with my daughter, and therefore become a single parent mom by the age of 21 with a high school diploma and on welfare, right? So, in the midst of going through all kinds of chaos with their dad, because that just wasn't going to work, um, and begging, borrowing, pleading, stealing to try and be with this man, but that was not going to work, I decided to go back to school. And it was the Lord who helped me to do that, make that decision. I remember saying things like, when someone would say, "Are you going to go to college?" I ain't giving nobody 5 years of my life. And so one day I said to myself, well, you on welfare raising two kids. What else you gonna do? What else you gonna do 5 years from
It was
now?
time for a change. Yep.
And so I was looking at various different jobs. This is how the Lord got me to go to school. I was looking at various different jobs and I would see these initials. It would say BSW or MSW. And I just thought they were initials. I didn't know they really meant something.
Not whole degrees.
So I would call these places and be like, hey, can I get an application for this job? And I would say what the job title was. And the lady said to me one day, she goes, well, do you have a BSW? And I said, what's that? And she said, a bachelor's in social work. I said, you mean a degree? Like college?
She's like, yes. Yes, a college degree.
I didn't know, but I could do the job. She was like, not without a bachelor's degree, you can't. And I'm headstrong, right? So I'm sitting here thinking, she don't know what she's talking about. I'm calling other places and they're all telling me the same. And in my mind, I'm thinking college is just a waste of time and where people take your money. And so one day I come in and on my desk or counter was this newspaper and it said, get your BSW in 18 months. And see, the Lord knew me well enough to know that I'm a determined person. If I'm gonna do right, I'm gonna do right 100%. If I'm gonna do wrong, I'm busting hell wide open, right?
There's no in between.
No, there's no in between.
That thing. No in between.
If I'm gonna do it, I'm gonna do it, right? So it said get your master's in 18 months. And the church that I was going to, they really push education. That's a part of the culture, Adventist culture. So, anyhow, I was thinking, oh, that's a year and some months. I can do that. I go and talk to a school advisor. I had these 2 years prerequisites that I had to do before I can get to them 18 months. But the Lord knew once it was in my mind, I was going to do it. What's to say, with God's provision and the things he was teaching me about myself along the way, I had my bumps and my bruises because I had to learn about my character. But the things that the Lord was teaching me along the way, and with his provisions, I started school when my daughter was 1. And that was January of 1994. And I had started school in January of 1994, got my associates, my bachelor's, and my master's, all within 5 years, and graduated from college with honors. And then went back for a second master's and graduated with a 3.92. And all of this as a single parent mom, and so there's so much that's in between all of that.
I'm sure.
But believe you me when I say it was just me, my son, and my daughter. And when I say God made provisions, he made provisions every step of the way. But those are testimonies in and of itself. I feel like I've lived several lifetimes.
Yes, you have, because you have really gone from physical and sexual abuse to not being raised with your mother, to being back and forth in different homes, foster care, losing your mom at a young, very impressionable age, to where you are today.
Yeah.
Right. And all those different experiences have shaped who you are, because you have now been able to use those experiences to help other people.
That I have. When I say I have lived a blessed life,
amen.
I truly, and still living one.
And so, you know what, let's talk about that a little bit, because to go through so many challenges, it's hard for people to sometimes go through such difficult things and be able to say that, right? And not to focus on, I went through this, and that, but to say, I have lived, not I am living a blessed life, I have lived a blessed life. How are you able to say that so confidently with that smile on your face?
I think it's like anything else. You come to recognize that so those people that I have served in my life, I've been a school social worker, school administrator. I left the schools as a school superintendent over alternative ed. And I left after serving some of the young people that were in Vista Maria, like myself. And now doing my practice full time, right?
And in the middle of that, I have to interrupt you, because in the middle of all that, you also went to the military and became a captain in the military. We don't have to get into that part of the story, but in addition to Thank you for your
Yeah.
service. Okay, now
And
you
into
can
the
continue.
military when I was 20 years old. And that was because they promised to help me pay back them student loans. That was 120,000. So I went in as a captain and served in the military, active duty for 3 years, under contract with them for 8 years, and was deployed to Afghanistan my first year in the military. And I was over 7 outlying clinics in Afghanistan. So, yeah, I always forget that part.
Because there's so many parts. Like you said, you've lived several lifetimes
Yeah.
at this point.
But, to go back to your question, the reason I can do it with a smile on my face is because although I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy the things I've gone through, I also would not change what I've gone through because it made me who I am today.
Mm-hmm.
It gave me the strength, it gave me the courage, the knowledge, and the wisdom that I needed to serve others. Not just others that are like myself, but just to serve others, period. And to help people see that adversity does not define you. It can make you or it can break you, but it doesn't define you. And where you come from does not determine where you're going in life. You do. Um, who can better tell you that if they've come out of the fire refined, you know? And so
Yes,
it does for me.
that is amazing. That is amazing. And so no, that is so well said. And it's true. You've gone through the fire and that purification process in a sense, right? Because you go through fire and it's a testing and trials. Um, but you can either grow from it, right? Or be buried under the weight of it. And
Yes.
so you mentioned earlier how challenging the holidays were for you. And so being that we are in the holiday season, I would love to know what your advice is for someone who has either gone through trials and tribulations and hard times or maybe currently experiencing a challenging time right now. What advice would you have? What would be something you can say to encourage them or to motivate them to get through this season?
Mm. You know, um, I think support. Sometimes people will say, oh, I'm alone or I'm all by myself. You're never truly alone and you're never truly by yourself. One of the things that I have found is church became my community. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a difference in my mind. Church is to be a part, is to become a part of your family and your community, but it does not define your relationship with God. It's important to have a relationship um, with God. And so for me to get around family and support, whether it was my biological family, whether it was my church family, but to have support really brought me through. My relationship with God, having the ability to have transparent, open conversations, tell God every single thing that's on my heart. I tell the Lord things that I can't tell human beings because they'll judge me, right? He
Mm-hmm.
knows my thoughts. And so, and not just know them because he knows them, but he knows them because I tell him. And so, having that personal relationship with God, all those things have made a difference in my life. So, holidays are no longer an issue for me, but I would tell people seek out. Don't be afraid to seek out support. Um, don't be afraid to put yourself in supportive environments that might not always feel comfortable to you right away.
Mm-hmm.
You know, one of the promises that I held on to, or that I have been able to see where God is a God of his word. He said, when your mother and father forsake you, I will take you up. When I was 21 years old, I was sitting in church, and the pastor was a visiting pastor, and he was up in the pulpit preaching. He looked down at me and saw me with my daughter. And he said that the Lord told him, this will be your daughter. And so from that day forward, that man and his wife claimed me as their daughter. And now understand, I didn't make it easy for him to be a dad to me
I'm sure.
because of everything I'd gone through with. When he
Mm-hmm.
would tell me things about myself, in my mind, I would be like, what are you trying to do? What do you want from me? but he stayed consistent. I never lived in the house with them, but he was more like a counselor, a
Mm-hmm.
mentor, and eventually I allowed him to be a dad to me. He proved himself to me. And so to this day, they're my parents. But I remember allowing myself to be in positions with people such as them, to dinner at their home, things like that, that would normally be uncomfortable for me, but actually provided a space for me, allowed me to feel like I was a part of something or someone else's family. When wasn't there with my own family. Um, so having that support and allowing myself to be uncomfortable with allowing people to get to know me and allowing people into my space and being willing to love on me, that really got me through. But the holidays now is a blessing like everything else.
That's amazing. That's amazing. The transformation that occurs when we heal from trauma, right?
Mhm.
How we can experience something that maybe at one point was painful, and be able to transform it into something that um, is helpful to our souls. And so I am so grateful that you took the chance on coming on here and sharing your story and being so open and vulnerable in telling us the different things you have experienced. I know that this episode, like the others, will bless someone. And so, once again, this is Miss Yvonne Brooks, owner at Repairer of the Breach, counseling and consulting services, and she is accepting clients if you are seeking someone to connect with. Thank you so much, Yvonne.
You are so welcome, and it was a blessing to be here.